Good evening, everybody. My name is Nicholas Sweetman. I'm the chairman of Irish Forest Owners. You're very welcome to our webinar and AGM. If I could begin by saying that we have two excellent speakers tonight, Áine Ní Dhubháin and Luke Dowd, both of UCD. And I'll come to introduce them in a second. But first of all, could I ask if you have any questions to wait until, well, you won't have an opportunity to speak, but would you add any questions you have to the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen? And at the end of each speech, then I will ask the speakers to address the questions if possible. So we're going to start off with Professor Áine Ní Dhubháin. Áine is Professor in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD and Deputy Vice Principal for Teaching and Learning. She is the Director of the Forestry Undergraduate Degree Programme, Bachelor of Agricultural Science Forestry. Some of you in IWP will be familiar with Áine from her great work on the Simwood project some years ago. Among her research interests are socio-economic impacts of forestry, farm forestry, and indeed forestry policy in general. And this evening, she will talk to us about the barriers to participation in forest owner organisations and forestry knowledge transfer events. So Áine, if you're ready, could you perhaps share your screen and we'll kick off.
Okay. Is that okay?
Yes, that's great.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Nicholas, and thanks, Olive, and indeed the Irish Forest Owners for inviting me to give a presentation tonight. I decided to present some research that a PhD student of mine, Jeremy Ryan, conducted over a 4-year period, and focusing on one aspect of it, which are the barriers to participation in forest owner organisations, and indeed barriers to participation in forestry transfer, knowledge transfer events in general. So I thought I'd start by giving you a little bit of the context, focusing on some key statistics, I suppose, in relation to European and Irish private forest ownership. Let you know about what we aim to do in our study, how we did it, what we found, and indeed what we learned from what we did. So some of this may be familiar to you. If you look at private forest ownership in Europe as a whole, you'll see how significant private forests are. If we take Europe, they account for almost half of the forests within the European continent. Then if we look at the European Union, they actually account for a greater proportion, 61% of the forest area. So private forests are important. They're also very fragmented. Very many of them are less than 10 hectares, and a significant proportion are even as small as 2 or 1 hectares. So when we look at the owners of those forests, we see that a lot has changed over the last 20 to 30 years. The typical private forest owner in Europe was a farmer who had a forest, usually supplying fuel. That has changed for a number of reasons. If we look at where communist countries, the forests in those countries that were once private, that were taken into state ownership, have now, to the most part, been given back to the families of the original owners through a restitution process. We also have the children of private forest owners now living in cities, not working on the farm anymore. So we have a group of forest owners in Europe who have no real traditional link to their forest, which is something that has changed a lot over the last 30 years. And indeed, we also have new forest owners, because Ireland isn't the only country that has experienced afforestation. So what that means, aside from the structural characteristics of the forest, that the owners themselves lack forest management knowledge. And if we look at what is to the right-hand side of my screen, we'll see this is all happening when society is placing more demands on the forests, where sustainable forest management is the paradigm by which forests are expected to be managed. And all of that means that forest owners need more knowledge and skills. So if we look at Ireland, we see that private forest owners or private forests are now in the majority. The last National Forest Inventory that was published recently showed for the first time since the foundation of the state that private forests now dominate the forest cover. Many of you online here are well aware that the size of the private forests is typically around 8.5 hectares. So we have this fragmented private forest cover. And we also have new owners. You know, most of our private forest owners have only owned forests for most since the 1980s. So we have new owners of new forests. Some of those are passing on those forests to the next generation, who again, more than likely are not going to be based in farms. So we have many similarities. These owners lack forest management knowledge, and they, as I showed in the previous slide, they're facing the same challenges that their European counterparts are facing. So with that in mind, some of the solutions that have been proposed, I should say, to these challenges are, you know, a big emphasis on knowledge transfer, trying to engage forest owners in knowledge transfer events. And then more specifically, organizations such as your own forest owner organizations have been throughout Europe proposed as a means of addressing not just the learning of owners and maybe seen as a means to encourage peer-to-peer learning amongst forest owners, but also to address some of the structural challenges. You know, there's a greater likelihood of private forests being harvested and the timber mobilized in them if the owners come together, and forest owner organizations are also seen as a means of, you know, linking the forest owner to the wider forestry sector. With all of that being said, there's clear information indeed from Europe and indeed ourselves in Ireland that forest owners' participation in forest owner organizations and indeed in broader forest knowledge transfer opportunities and events is low. So with all of this in mind, when Jeremy started with me, oh God, 4 or 5 years ago, he was very interested in forest owner organizations. So he set about looking at the catalysts and drivers for their establishment in Ireland, looking at what forms and models of forest owner organizations had developed. And I suspect, again, that many of you on this call or this webinar may have actually spoken to him. So he has a lot of work done, and what I wanted to focus on today was the latter one there in red, and that was to look at what are the barriers to owners' participating in organizations, forest owner organizations, and again in opportunities for their learning. So he went about doing that in the end of 2018, beginning of 2009, where he interviewed 39 individuals, CEOs, etc., chairpersons of forest owner organizations, and all those interviews were transcribed. And what we found in the context of participation was that recruitment, retention, and indeed participation in organizations is a challenge. And what I've tried to do in those little speech bubbles is include some of the text that he got in the interviews. So as one interviewee indicated, participation in education initiatives by forest owners is nothing like you would consider satisfactory. That's a conundrum. Nobody can figure out why there's such a poor take-up or willingness to educate yourself on a crop that you've planted. Also, participation of owners in learning activities, even outside of the organizations, was considered low. And, you know, as somebody suggested, that may be through age, through different things. Maybe owners have commitments. It just doesn't happen. They're just not interested. And there's only so much you can do at the end of the day. And what he learned through those interviews was that there was a range of possible factors influencing these participation rates. Some of them come back to the owner and their attitudes themselves. It was felt that some owners didn't actually recognize their knowledge needs. Some had negative beliefs about their ability to succeed in respect of forest management. And indeed, some held negative beliefs about the benefits of membership of organisations or indeed participating in educational initiatives. As one person said, these are the people who would have planted the poorest corner of the farm because it grew nothing, only rushes anyway. They shut the gate, they got the 15 years premium, they don't care about it, they don't go to forestry events, you know, so there's a large subset of people in that category. Other potential factors that this group of 39 identified was a lack of trust, that there is a lack of trust among some owners about the motivation of knowledge providers based on past negative experience. As one said, you're getting involved in a business, you know nothing, so you're waiting to be taken advantage of. And there are plenty in the timber industry that will take advantage of you. Alongside that, there was a belief that private or forest owners were perhaps not willing to pay for knowledge and information services, or at least willing to pay very little. As one said, farmers just don't pay you for knowledge and information services. That's the reality of it. We don't know how to sort it out, but it needs to be done. Other more, I suppose, family and professional type factors could be indeed family circumstances, professional commitments, and, you know, age and gender could play a role in an owner's ability to participate. And it was noted, and this is again not a feature of Ireland, it's a feature across ownership in Europe, is that women owners are underrepresented, and indeed younger owners are underrepresented in events and in forest owner organisations. So as one indicated, the whole problem with participation, as you have in many areas, is that you have absentee forest owners. That's the problem. And like that's an issue that's not really being highlighted. Another individual indicated he'd a neighbour just across the road. She's a widow woman. I actually have her application there for a felling licence, and that woman wouldn't go to a meeting, i.e. an education event like that in a million years. And then there were issues identified in relation to the events themselves, that perhaps, you know, older or less recent approaches to knowledge transfer have been kind of a top-down approach with the experts leading. That has evolved more into field events and discussions where owners are involved, but they may be at times that don't suit owners, or indeed, you know, many owner organisations may not have the facilities to either hold meetings or to organise events. So with that, as we call it, qualitative type interview or information from the people that Jeremy had interviewed, a decision was made that we'd try to tease this out a bit further. And we did that by focusing specifically on those two aspects I've just mentioned, trying to understand the barriers to participation, and then seeing if being a member of an owner organisation actually influenced how those barriers were or are experienced. Jeremy had great plans to go to a whole series of field events in 2021. He had planned to put together a questionnaire, which he did, and go to events and interview forest owners. But as we all know, such events went by the wayside with COVID. So we had to pivot very quickly. And I'd like to, again, note my appreciation and his appreciation to people within this group, and indeed others, who quickly helped us circulate a survey with 60 questions. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, to members of forest owner groups. We had 277 members of 2 forest owner organisations who got our questionnaire. And then some of the facilitators of the forestry knowledge transfer groups and programmes agreed to circulate current and past applicants to those knowledge transfer programmes. 223 received our questionnaire. So in total, 500 went out in the spring of 2021. We got 185 responses, which for somebody like myself who's been involved in surveying farmers and forest owners for over 30 years, that's a good response rate. Half of those that responded were members of forest owner organisations. As I say, this questionnaire had 60 questions, and what we tried to structure it or frame it according to a framework that had been developed for adult learners. So, you know, we saw forest owners engaging in knowledge transfer and learning opportunities as adult learners, which they are. And so we used a framework by a person called Patricia Cross, who divided potential barriers to participation in adult learning into 3 groups. One she described as dispositional, which really related to the attitudes, the values and the perceptions of the learner, in this case, a forest owner. Situational factors, which related to the personal and professional responsibilities that the learner might have. The distance to an event might be an issue, as indeed might be the physical health and mobility of the learner. And finally, there might be some institutional barriers associated with the maybe guidelines and procedures. You know, even 4 years ago, access or being familiar with Zoom might have been perceived as a barrier to engaging in an event like this. So obviously 60 questions in the questionnaire. I'm not going to show you them all. Just to give you a flavour, we tried to capture the information we were looking for directly and then indirectly, so that we could kind of triangulate our results. So there was a question that the respondents were asked, you know, which of the following restricts your ability to engage with learning opportunities? So family commitments, physical health, availability of personal transport, and indeed difficulties with hearing and or vision. And then or at least we thought we were trying to capture some of those issues more subtly by presenting a statement and asking the respondents to indicate their level of agreement. So, for example, we gave the statement, the older I get, the more difficult I find it to learn. And then people were allowed to indicate from a scale of 1 to 5 their level of agreement with that. So what did we find? I'm only going to give you a small snapshot of this in the interest of time. So one of the questions which we classed as a dispositional factor was how the sources of the knowledge, so to speak. So we asked the respondents to indicate how important the various knowledge providers listed there were to them. The closer the number you see given to 5, the more important it is. So you'll see there that overall, the forest owner organisation was ranked or classed as the most important knowledge provider. The least important were things like forestry equipment, suppliers, forest industry, people, etc. Then if we teased it out slightly, because we had some of those that answered our questions were already members of forest owner organisations, some weren't. And so when we broke it down according to that, again, I suppose it's not earth-shattering to discover that the forest owner organisation is the most important knowledge provider to members of that organisation. It's still important to those who aren't members, but private forestry consultants came out the highest there. We also thought it was important to capture what priorities owners had for their forests, and they were given the 4 options that you see there: maximising financial income, maximising environmental externalities, maximising biodiversity, or amenity. And the one thing that struck me is how important all of these are. There are obviously some higher than others. Financial income was the most important on average for everybody, but not that much higher than external environment and biodiversity. The members of the owner organisations emphasised income higher than those that weren't members. Where did the owners get their information from? And text message was by far the most common source of information about forestry events, with emails, etc., being a little bit less so. That might provide some information to indeed Olive. In terms of some of the statements we gave them, again, there was a strong level agreement amongst everybody that those that took part in the survey really placed a high personal value on learning about forest management, how much they greatly enjoyed meeting other forest owners. Maybe a little bit less seeing themselves as having a lot in common with other forest owners. The only reason I highlight those two figures there in red, I'm not going to go into statistics tonight, but just to say that there seemed to be a tendency for forest owner organisation members to have a slightly stronger desire to progress further in their learning about forest management compared to those that weren't members. We're looking at what we would call the situational characteristics, and that really, what you're seeing here is just the age and gender of those that responded. I suppose it's no surprise to us. We hear that forest owners, both in Ireland and across Europe, are, I was going to say not spring chickens, but you can see that the typical most common group that responded would have been the 60 to 69 age group. Interestingly, and I'm not quite sure the significance of this, but certainly the decade or the cohort 10 years older than that, there were more of those that were members of forest owner organisations versus those that weren't. So we generally have, at least in terms of respondents, and that to some extent matches what we know about owners at large in Ireland, we have an older cohort. In terms of the gender, most respondents were male. Slightly greater proportion of the forest owner organisation members were female than the general trend. In terms of what restricted their ability to engage with learning opportunities, I suppose to our surprise, based on what we learned in the first study, availability of personal transport, physical health or physical mobility, vision and hearing, maybe difficulties, were issues only for a very small proportion of those that responded. However, a quarter of those indicated that family commitments and responsibilities did restrict their ability to engage with learning opportunities. Again, looking at some of the statements that try to capture those situational factors perhaps a little bit more subtly, or to see if they agreed with what we found with the earlier question, you can see that a very high agreement that the respondents had the support of their families to attend education programs. That number went down in relation to the amount of time, or there was a lower ranking or score for having enough time to attend owner events. Certainly, respondents did not feel that the older they got, the more difficult they found it to learn. That's why their number that mean for that last statement on your screen, at least certainly on my screen, is 2.61. Okay, so nearly finished. You'd be glad to know. I just wanted to highlight what approach to knowledge transfer the respondents felt was the most effective. And you can see there the guided field trips, the forest walks, the being in the forest, was scored really highly. Respondents really felt that was the most effective way of transferring knowledge. ICT, computer, printed literature, much lower. And that was true for those, whether they were a member of an organisation such as yours or indeed were not. So, what did we learn? Well, we learned that family commitments is a barrier to engaging either in forest owner organisations or knowledge transfer events. When we delved a little bit deeper in that, that seemed to be associated with the younger respondents. We didn't find that the age of the owners, their attitudes, the timing of events, they didn't seem to be issues influencing their engagement in learning opportunities. What it does show also is how important forest owner organisations have become as knowledge providers to owners. And I think the fact that we saw such a high ranking for all of the objectives that owners had an option to choose from means that I think there's going to be greater demand for knowledge, because if owners are managing for the environment, managing for biodiversity, and managing for income, that's just going to increase their knowledge requirements. What's important to state is what we surveyed were not your typical forest owner. We surveyed what we called learning-oriented owners. These were owners who had made the decision to engage in a knowledge transfer program, or indeed to become a member of a forest owner organisation. We didn't capture the non-engagers. So I suppose my final points is, and I've mentioned this in the previous slide, the knowledge needs are going to increase. Now, that's not just true for owners, that's true for foresters. Is there a plan for this? I don't know. I've just raised that question there. And I suppose we still don't know, despite all our work, is what is stopping, you know, a significant cohort of forest owners accessing knowledge. Because, you know, if people aren't turning up at events, they're not becoming members of owner groups. We as researchers and you as members of owner groups yourselves, it's very hard to find those people to ask why. The days of being able to, you know, send out a questionnaire, even if I could send out a questionnaire, you know, there's no requirement for somebody to complete it. So we still have a big question mark over, as I call them, the non-engagers. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I just want to mention that much of the work done in this project was self-funded by Jeremy Ryan. We got a small amount of funding from the department that covered the cost of the postage for the surveys and some of Jeremy's travel costs. And I would like to take this opportunity, because I rarely get it, to thank all the forest owners who took part in the study. You know, without your input, we have no data in which to do our research. So with that in mind, I'll finish up. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Áine. I remind everybody that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and please use it if you have any questions for Áine.
Nicholas, sorry, I'm just going to jump in. I'm actually going to open everyone's mic as well. It's not a huge group, so
Okay.
I do think that might be easier. So just
Yeah.
you can go ahead, Nicholas, and I'll just open everyone's mic if they do want to unmute and ask a question.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank Áine for a really good summary of the situation with regard to forest owner groups. And just to make a couple of points, it's clear from her research and for Jeremy's research that there's a huge need for our type of organisation. And it was very interesting to me that there was a clear, not bias, but a clear top interest in the commercial side of forestry among the members of producer groups. And that's an item that I hope to deal with later on, perhaps. So now I have one question in already, so I'll just read that one. And it's from Owen Cooney, and it's more as a comment than a question. I feel that a slow shift in owners' intentions to offload their forest to investment funds, driven by the overload in Forest Service regulations, is taking place, which is a pity. Would you like to comment on that, Áine?
Well, for somebody who likes data, I mean, that would be something I'd love to get the hard facts on, because, for example, I was just looking there before I turned on the Forestry annual statistics, and I don't think that's captured there, to get a sense of, in any one year, what proportion of private forests change ownership. And while we don't need to know the name of the individual, it would be good to know if they're changing ownership to another private forest owner, or are they going to funds or whatever. So I mean, the objectives from when I started doing research on farm forestry was, for a long period of time, to provide farmers with an alternative source of income from their forests, or from their farms. So I'm guessing, well, there's no guessing, if they pass that ownership on to somebody else, I'm not sure how that will benefit their farming, but everybody is entitled to do with what they wish with their own land.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Olive, did you want to, I see you wanted to say something on that one?
Not necessarily on that. There's definitely, I mean, I actually also, when I took over, when we set up Irish Forest Owners, I did a survey, and the data is so similar, a much smaller number of respondents, but the trends are very much the same. I think it's very reassuring to see that the field days are of value. I think the people involved in the committees of the groups kind of feel we've done field days to death in a way, but I do think there is a huge value there. And I think that in-person in forest is important. One thing though that I've been thinking a lot about is how might we engage the non-engagers, as you say.
Yeah.
And one idea I have now, I don't know whether people, I feel that at afforestation that there should be a learning module that's mandatory as part of getting your afforestation license. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts, because I think that then kind of puts the root in the need for learning and for ongoing learning throughout the development of the forest. And if those seeds are planted right at afforestation, we have that engagement and hopefully then continued learning. And Áine, I was just wondering if you have any thoughts, or if you have any other thoughts on how we might engage more
a couple of
broadly.
things. I suppose, to come back, I mean, we've had examples, the REP scheme, I'm less familiar with the later iterations of it, but, for some of the agricultural schemes, learning is and was a prerequisite, whether it still is,
It is
for
in your case,
engaging. Yeah. So, and I think to me, the importance of learning, and why I've always been interested in this topic, it isn't that, it is to empower the owner, not necessarily to do any, get involved directly in the management, but to be aware of when he or she perhaps has been taken advantage of, or to have enough knowledge to make a sound judgment as to who they're engaging and what they're doing. Another thing I was thinking about before I came here, again, it comes back to information. I mean, I suppose in my presentation and in Jeremy's work, there is an assumption that those that are not engaging in the groups and in learning activities are doing things differently and are perhaps not, we don't know what they're actually doing in terms of management. We're making assumptions because they're not engaging in learning opportunities, that they're not engaging in management. Potentially, they may have plenty of knowledge and are doing a good job. It's just that there's no mechanism really, for checking exactly what's going on in private forests once the premium, is gone. There's no requirement under the premium the grants to actually manage your forest. You just have to have them there, you know. So we're working in a knowledge gap, ironically, to use that term. We don't know what's going on in a lot of the private forests, is what I was trying to get my way around. So until we get that information or find a way of getting that information, maybe we're making assumptions that potentially aren't valid.
Okay, I have a comment more than a question again from Andy Dunn here. Áine, you might kindly send your findings to the Forest Service. They could do with taking them on board. Perhaps you might say whether Jeremy has submitted.
Well, interesting, you see, they didn't, normally if this was a DAFM funded project, they certainly would have got all the findings. Yeah, I can certainly send, subject to Jeremy approving it. It is his thesis to them. It is 250 pages long. I can see where it might end up.
Yes, I won't comment further on that one. Any more questions? If you want to raise your hand, if you don't want to type in a question, if you want to use the raise hand function, I can see it if you do.
I don't know whether I'm muted or not.
Derek, here, go ahead.
Here.
Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, no, just that was an insightful presentation, and it does give us an insight to our members and their thinking. One of the findings I think that we come across on a daily basis is the average age group of forest owners is quite high. And that brings on the next issue then of succession planning. And you alluded to it in the earlier part of your presentation about the fragmentation of forestry holdings, not alone here, but across Europe. And the necessity, I suppose, for consolidation around that. And maybe at some point in the future with some of your students that you would expand even your research and do some sort of a comparative analysis between, we'll say, the Nordic countries, Finland in particular, where they utilize cooperative structures for forest management. In other words, to be able to bring that into the Irish situation where, 10, 15, 20, maybe even 100 farmer foresters would come together and manage their forestries as a unit. It's something we're not very, very good at, but your thinking on that would be just interesting.
Yeah, I suppose that's almost what drove Jeremy to do this piece of research, because he was actually interested in joint management. And I'm speaking for him here. He's not, I think he'd done some research previously on deer. We won't get into deer now because I know nothing about them, but deer management on a collaborative basis, work he did in the UK. So, and there are models, and indeed the Western Forestry Co-op was, I can remember in the late 80s, had tried to initiate that, where you had owners with contiguous, trying to get these contiguous pieces of, poorish pieces of ground on farms afforested. So you moved from your 4 or 5 hectare small piece on one farm with, making that area bigger by having the pieces of ground contiguous. I mean, a lot of it, there's been no research directly on that, but a lot of it, there's a resistance certainly in some parts of Europe, certainly in Eastern Europe, to that whole cooperative structure. I mean, you can be in a cooperative without necessarily cooperatively managing your forest. So, there's different models of how that cooperation can work. So certainly in some parts of Europe where, I suppose, the ex-communist countries, there's a strong resistance to cooperatives and of what you might be describing there, simply because of history. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but we have no examples of that yet.
Yeah, and I suppose just from a summary point of view, just it's that issue about the fragmentation and the consolidation of that and succession planning, and I think they're just major issues that we would come across with our work. That's all, and there needs to be further studies done around that, possibly. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take that on board. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any further questions? Is that Kevin Flanagan? Do you have a question? All right. Maybe not. Okay, look, I want to just thank Áine for her talk, which was extremely informative, and I agree with Andy. You probably could send it to the Forest Service to some general benefit. And I'm going to move on now, though, because we are actually over time already.
And I have to leave. So again, thank you all for allowing me to speak. And if you see another request for information coming out, because another hat I wear is continuous cover forestry, and that's something I'm always also interested in. So if you see a survey coming, you'll say, yes, I'll answer that for Áine, because she might come back again and talk to us.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will.
Thanks.
Thank you,
All the
Áine.
best.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, our next speaker is Luke Dowd. Luke is a researcher in the UCD Department of Agriculture, and he's currently working on a DAFM-funded project called Adapt for Resilience, which aims to help us understand how changes in climate may impact on the sustainability of Irish forestry, and to examine pathways which may reduce the negative effects of climate change on Irish forests. But his topic for this evening is carbon dynamics in Irish forests. So over to you, Luke.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Just to make sure you can see the screen and everything's working okay at the moment.
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, my